At this point in time, we're going to turn our attention to Matthew's gospel. We've been working our way through this on Sunday mornings. We're in chapter 5, verses 38 to 48 this morning. And this is kind of part 2 from last week. And so if you didn't catch us last week, I'll catch you up to speed just very quickly in a moment. But essentially, we're looking at the issue of righteousness. And righteousness, I was mentioning last week, as I heard it defined many times throughout growing up from many different churches or religious groups, righteousness was all these different good things that you do as a Christian. It was all the good stuff that all the good Christians do. And I believe in Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, he's going to kind of redefine that for us. I even saw a little bit of flavor of that this past week. I had a couple different interactions with people, and both of these times, many people were not followers of Jesus in these environments. So one night this past week, I did a wedding for a friend, and he invited several of his close friends, and many of them weren't followers of Christ. Some of them were kind of just non-religious or non-committed or had bad experiences with religions in the past. And so enters the pastor into the room, and people have all these different ideas about what pastors think and stereotypes. And so one of the questions was, at this particular wedding, they were going to have a drink of alcohol to celebrate. And so they turned to me and, will we offend you if we do this in our house, at our wedding? Because you're a pastor, and surely you have all these rules. And that was the idea. And I responded to that. I said, no, that's not going to offend me at all. If you have this to celebrate your wedding at your house, go right ahead. It's not about these different rules that define us. It's more about the types of relationships that Jesus has with people. We had another experience last night with some good friends we've gotten connected to through our kids from throughout the community. And some of these families, they're all over the place as far as their religious traditions or beliefs or lack thereof. And so just a good variety of people. And again, in that group, it's taken time for me to kind of wear out that stereotype of a pastor because they expect me to be very judgmental of them, to have all these opinions, to look down on them maybe for different things they do that I don't because I have a different set of rules in their mind than they do. And the rules, again, are what make me righteous. But as we look from Jesus' perspective, I think that we're forced to come to grips with the fact that that's not really the case, and that oftentimes if we have that mentality, rules, one, they don't quite get you there. They don't get you to becoming like God. But two, they give people the wrong impressions about what Jesus came to bring in the first place, and that is a relationship that we can experience with God. And so just to recap last week briefly, righteousness, I believe Jesus is teaching, it's not about following right rules. That's not the mentality or the perspective. It's about fostering right relationships. And so last week we looked at some different types of relationships, but rules are limited, right? Because you can't create a rule for everything. You can't predict every possibility, right? I mean, you can make some good rules, but you can't prevent every wrong from happening. You can't possibly do that. And you may obey a rule, but it doesn't mean you have a good attitude. So rules can never change your attitude or my attitude. So that rules mentality falls short in different ways. Righteousness, again, it's really about relationships. And last week we learned it's about pursuing reconciliation. That's part of what righteousness means. So we got to redefine it. If we thought about righteousness as doing all these good things and keeping all of God's good rules, we need to think of it differently. Part of it is reconciliation. Reconciling relationships with people and reconciling relationships with God. That's kind of the heart of righteousness. Another aspect of it that we looked at last week, it's also pursuing reliability with God and with people. And so in the marriages that we're committed to now, and in the promises that we make to our kids and our friends and people in our lives, we want to keep those promises. In the promises that we make before God, we want to be reliable. Because righteousness, part of it is reliability. And today we're going to look at two final aspects that Jesus focuses on, kind of the other two aspects of righteousness, I believe, today. And the first thing we'll look at this morning is relinquishment. It's kind of a fancy word. If you like simple words, you can say releasing or letting go, open hands, the same concept, the same idea. And this is how Jesus begins in Matthew 5:38. He says, "You've heard it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. So Jesus is going back to some phrases in the Old Testament. An eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth was this thing called the law of retaliation. So the law of Moses in the Old Testament allowed for retaliation that was consistent with the crime. So if somebody took your donkey and it got injured, you could take somebody else's donkey and injure it, to create some sort of equality, because there wasn't exactly the greatest court system many times throughout ancient Israel. And so it was kind of people taking the law into their hands almost and trying to equate justice. They even had something that was called an avenger. And so if somebody killed someone in your family accidentally or on purpose, your family could designate an avenger to go and seek out that person and take their life. And they had these cities of refuge where those people that were, had been either accidental killers or intentional murders could flee to until they had a fair trial. And so just this thing of we're going to kind of take the law into our own hands and equate justice out because we don't have this really well-defined court system. And so you could justify a lot of things in Old Testament Israel if somebody offended you and they did something wrong. I remember there was a time at the end of my high school years, actually right after I graduated from my senior year of high school. I had just gotten a job, and so I was finally making some consistent income. And I had an adult in my life who had a leadership position in my life who came to me and said, you really should take $300 of this money that I didn't have much of because I was saving for college and I just started a job a few weeks ago, but you should take one of your paychecks and you should invest it in this business that I'm going to present to you, which is actually a pyramid scheme. And because at that point in time, one, I didn't have a lot of business savvy, and two, I had a lot of trust in this person, didn't want to let this person down who had, a position of respect in my life and a leadership and influence, and they were older. I looked up to them. I said, okay. And then I realized within the week what I had done and how foolish that was, and that I would never see a cent of that the rest of my life. And at that point in time, I kind of had a choice. Am I going to try to get even, or am I going to let this go? And because of the position this person held, I probably could have made quite a public issue of this and could have probably cast a pretty poor light on that individual and maybe caused a lot of other people to question them and their integrity as well. But that was one of those things where I just kind of chose to let it go instead of retaliating. And Jesus in this situation is talking about some times when maybe it's better for us to let things go than to retaliate. Because when we're trying to accomplish what God's kingdom is trying to accomplish, oftentimes there's a better way other than retaliation to actually make some more headway in people's lives and to create a path that will draw them closer to God. Sometimes our retaliation just pushes them further away or slams closed doors. So Jesus is going to talk about another way, another option, something that's more righteous, we might say. And that's relinquishing that ability to retaliate. He says in verse 39, but I tell you, don't resist an evildoer. And the idea behind that term evildoer, it's somebody who's hurtful. There's different words in the New Testament for evil. Some of it refers to people who have evil hearts or evil natures. Some of it refers to things in the natural world. But this is talking about a person that's hurtful. So they're harmful or hurtful person. They want to cause you some sort of hurt. And he says, you could retaliate, but don't. In other words, he's teaching that giving up our rights, which is a scary thing to think about because we have rights and we want to use them sometimes, but giving up our rights, it might actually be a better way to represent God's kingdom than trying to retaliate when it comes to a hurtful individual. And I want to pause here for a moment as well because when we talk about retaliation, we think about all these different scenarios. And so what about war? Does that mean that it's never right to fight back or self-defense or all these things? What about somebody in an abusive relationship where they're dealing with an abuser? I think that, again, Jesus is talking about kind of a more personal situation here where it's somebody in your community, maybe one of your neighbors, somebody in a community that you're a part of, a job that you're a part of, something like that. Just somebody's done something generally to hurt you. And so this might not be fitting for every single case and every single scenario. There might be other ways that need to be responded with. Also, sometimes if we just give up our rights, it actually enables somebody further. Think of somebody in an abusive relationship and they say, well, I'm just going to submit. I'm going to let this person treat me however they want. that's not actually beneficial for the person who's involved, for the abuser, right? So backing off and giving up your rights isn't actually something that's beneficial. And I think that might be a good way to draw the contrast between what Jesus is talking about and what he's not talking about. Sometimes giving up our rights is going to be more beneficial. It's going to pull somebody closer to God's kingdom, closer to Jesus, than actually standing up and retaliating. And I think that's the scenario where we want to consider this option. We want to let go. We want to relinquish our rights. And Jesus is going to give us some more practical examples in his day and age, and maybe we can translate that into our day and age a little bit in the next few phrases. He says, on the contrary, so here's some real world scenarios of when you might choose to give up your rights, at least in first century Israel. If anybody slaps you on your right cheek, turn the other one to him also. So pretty famous verse, turn the other cheek. It's a phrase people use even if they're not familiar with the Bible. But what is Jesus actually talking about? There's a writer named Dr. Walter Wink, and he wrote a book called Jesus and Nonviolence, and he asked some questions to kind of give us some more insight into this passage. Note that Jesus talks about being slapped on your right cheek. He says, why does Jesus reference the right cheek specifically? It's kind of interesting, isn't it? I wonder why. He says, this is Dr. Walter Wink, the answer is both challenging and enlightening. Jesus lived in a right-handed world where left hands were reserved for unclean tasks. There are many cultures today where that's the case as well. Here in the United States, we have antibacterial soap and water, free-flowing everywhere. But in many cultures, the left hand is used for anything that might create uncleanness or germs. And so the right hand is the clean hand, and it's used for tasks like eating or showing affection to other people. The left hand you kind of leave to yourself because there's not always a chance to wash it. And that was the world of Jesus. And so this writer says we can assume that the person doing the hitting, they wouldn't have used their left hand. That's the unclean hand. So somebody's right cheek, again, they're facing you. So if they're facing you, you're going to, in our day and age, you'd think you're using your left hand to smack them on the right cheek. But the left hand is the unclean hand. So you're not using the left hand. You're actually using the clean hand, the right hand. But you're not hitting them forward. You're hitting them with the back of your hand. And in this culture, when you smack somebody on the cheek with the back of your hand, it's an insult. He says, such a blow connotes an insult, not a fist fight. It was the normal way to reprimand somebody whom you had power over. So a master to a slave, backhand on the right cheek. Sometimes husbands to wives in this culture, I'm in power over you, backhand. Or Romans to Jews, we are the ruling people. You are in submission to us, backhand. So it made a statement about somebody's value, about somebody's position, about somebody's lack of power. And if you strike somebody who's your equal in that way, you could actually pay huge fines. And even the Jewish Mishnah, which was kind of a law that Israel had to obey, that was upheld by the courts of Israel, if you backhanded somebody who was of your same status in society, it carried a fine of anywhere between 100 and 400 days' wages. That's a hefty fine for insulting somebody of your social status, your same social status. So that would have been avoided at all costs. And so here's a scenario. You just backhanded somebody on their right cheek to show them you're inferior to me. And they turn their left cheek to you. And you have two options. One, you can backhand them, but you can't use the right hand because you're facing the wrong way. So you can hit them with your left hand, which is your unclean hand. And so that forces you to come to grips with the fact that not only have you hit them with an unclean hand, but the act that you're doing, it's kind of unclean, right? It's not the right way to go about it. Or you can smack them a normal way with the palm of your hand using your right hand. But if you do that, you're admitting that they're more of an equal, because you smacked them the way that you would an equal, not somebody who was subordinate to you. And so this is a very interesting way of response. And I think what Jesus is trying to get us to understand here is that sometimes when we give up our rights, in certain scenarios, by giving up our rights to retaliate, we might invite the person who's hurtful to us to make some conclusions. In this case, the person might think, oh, my actions, they're unclean. I got to use that unclean hand. Or they might think, I'm mistreating somebody, but if I hit him that way, they're an equal to me. And come to grips with the fact that maybe this person is more of an equal than what they thought of. But it gets them thinking a little bit. And sometimes when you give up your rights, people wonder, why did you do that? It makes people think. It also can do another thing in verse 40. He says, as for the one who wants to sue you and take away your shirt, let him have your coat as well. And so I want to show you a picture here for a moment on the next slide. So this is Roman society. We're going back to the way people would dress here. So there is a garment called a chiton and one called a hamartion. And one is kind of an inner, like it's the basic robe that you would dress and cover with. And the other one is a wrap that's wrapped around you. And so you can see in these pictures, there are some garments that are either white or beige that are underneath, and then there are some more colorful wraps that are around them. So that was the cloak. And so your shirt would have been the basic covering, the robe that you're wearing kind of, and then your cloak would have wrapped around that. And you can see different forms here, and if you want to go to the next slide as well, these are statues, obviously, that are carved from that period, and so this is also the way that the outfits would work. And so just to give you a visual for that, you can go to the next slide now. So he says, if somebody takes you to court and they want to sue you and take away your shirt, so that base garment that you're dressed in, let him have your coat as well. An author named Kathleen Rushton states, Jesus' response, give your cloak, your outer coat as well, is pretty astonishing. Because if you're in court and somebody sues you and they take your base cloak and you give them your outer coat as well, what are you wearing? Nothing in court. And so when you do that, you take away their property, you strip them of that, you strip them of their land, and you're here carrying everything, all of their dignity, in your hands in court. It actually reveals a lot about you as a person. You look like less of somebody, who has the right ambitions in court and more like a jerk to them. And it actually invites conviction. And so sometimes when you give up something, you give up your right, even though somebody has taken advantage of you and you could try to retaliate and you could try to sue somebody, but you give it up to them, it causes conviction. It invites conviction. And it leaves somebody to believe, I must not really care about other people very much. I don't have much concern for other people because I'm willing to take away everything from them. And I'm holding it here in my hand, and they're there left with nothing. And it also causes you to question a little bit about your idea of justice. Because the whole premise of coming to court in the first place, right, is to accomplish justice. And here you are, you've sued someone for everything they have, and then they've given you the rest of everything that they have, and you realize, I'm actually a cause for injustice. Sometimes when people hurt us, they mistreat us, they're the ones being unjust. But by giving up our rights, it can show them just how unjust they're being. And they can start to be convicted by their conscience over that. And then there's one final third thing that giving up our rights can accomplish. Verse 41, Jesus says, if anybody forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2. I think there's a couple of things that are behind this. First of all, in Roman society, Roman times, whenever an officer of the Roman government or a Roman soldier needed help from somebody, they could kind of requisition that help. And there were limitations that were put on that. But I want to read a few quotes of some ancient inscriptions and ancient documents. The first one was a stone inscription found in Turkey that dates to between 14 and 37 AD, so right in this time period of when Jesus is talking. It said, shelter and hospitality should be provided without payment for all members of my own staff, for persons on military service from other provinces, and for freedmen and slaves of the princes of the land, in such a way that do not exceed services or exact services without payment from people who are unwilling. And so there's limitations on it, but at the same time, shelter, if a Roman soldier came to you or a Roman official and they said, I need a place to sleep tonight, you were obligated as a citizen of Rome to give that to them. They could force you to do that. If they said, I need some hospitality, I've got some pretty heavy bags, I've been carrying this spear for quite a while, I've got some weapons, I've got some animals with me, I've got some sacks that I need to carry and move from one place to another, I need your help. They could actually force you to carry that a certain way down the road. And we don't know for certain if it was a mile of distance or if that's something that Jesus just kind of used for an illustration, but they could force you to do something for them, to walk with them, to carry things for them, to help them out, to provide them with a place to stay if they were on official business. And so Jesus is saying if somebody forces you to do that, and again, the Jews and the Romans there was a lot of friction in their relationship. The Jews resented the Romans and their power that they had in their area. So most Jews would be tempted to resist. But Jesus is saying if someone does that, instead of resisting, again, give up your rights. You feel like nobody should be able to force me to do this. Just because they're in power doesn't mean they can force me to do whatever they want. Jesus says, instead of resisting, why don't you just go 2 miles with them instead of 1? And there's a couple possibilities here. One, it might actually invite consequences for them because, as we mentioned, there were limitations that were put on Roman soldiers and officials and what they could do. And so maybe there's a limitation of only going a mile, and so by doing this, there could be a complaint that was lodged. And this soldier might think, well, they keep walking with me. What if somebody complains that I'm abusing them and somebody in authority over me, they call me into account and there's some consequences because of that? What if that happens? And so maybe if we do a little extra, people might think about the consequences of what they're doing. But I think there's another thing that might be equally relevant in this situation as well. If somebody has the ability to force us to do something, they make us help them out. It's not convenient for us, but we do it anyway. We don't just do it, but we do a little bit extra to help them. It actually demonstrates that people are way more important than our own convenience. Because, 1 mile was one thing, but walking another mile, it's going to take me another 10, 15, 20 minutes or longer if I'm carrying really heavy things or trying to pull a donkey along with me for the soldier or a horse or something like that. And so it's going to take time out from me. But it's also going to show that person, even though they know, in this case, in this setting, I'm a Jew and this is a Roman soldier, and they know that we don't like each other, if I do this thing for them and I go beyond and I do even more, they're going to see I really am valuable. They were willing to give up their convenience to help me even more. And so it expresses God's kingdom in that sense. These people are different. These followers of Jesus, their lives look different. They'll give up something in order to help someone else, even if they culturally shouldn't do that, even if they should resist or they should hate that. They don't do that. Jesus kind of summarizes this aspect again of relinquishment, of releasing things with this final phrase in verse 42. He says, give to the one who asks you, and don't turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. So it's not always about giving up our rights to people who hurt us. Sometimes it's just about letting go of the stuff and the things that we have anyway when people generally or genuinely need it. So I put here on your notes, we shouldn't refuse a neighbor's request when we have the resources to honor it. And even maybe sometimes when we don't. We can look at different churches in the New Testament that gave even above and beyond their ability. And so there might even be a time when God has you sacrifice. You don't have much, but you take part of your little, part of what's not even sufficient to meet your own needs. When a neighbor comes knocking on the door, or a friend says, I have this need, or one of your kids calls you up and says, can you help me out in this way? Even though you don't have an abundance, you still might sacrifice. But definitely if you look around and you say, I've got the resources for that, then we should take action, and we should honor, and we should give to people. But what if I need it? What if tomorrow, I don't know what tomorrow is going to hold. What if I end up needing that thing and I just gave it away yesterday because somebody asked me for it? Proverbs 3:27, 28, and 29, the writer of this proverb says, when it's in your power, don't withhold good from the one who it belongs to. So he's saying good actually belongs to people. If you have this opportunity to show kindness or meet a need for someone else, you have the resource, don't hold on to it. Because that good thing, that good act that you can do for them, it actually belongs to them. This passage goes on to say, don't say to your neighbor, go away, come back later, I'll give it to you tomorrow, when it's there with you. Don't plan any harm against your neighbor because he trusts you and lives near you. So keep those relationships with people who are close to you in your life. Keep them good. If you have the ability to meet someone's need, don't hold on to it because you think, well, maybe I'll need that someday. Just relinquish it. Let go. Meet a need. Then there's another possibility. What if I don't get it back, right? What if I gave something away? Or what if I, more realistically, what if I let somebody borrow something? I lend it to them, but they never give anything back. I've got 2 or 3 neighbors, and they talk about how this one person, they always borrow things, and they never give it back. What if I don't get this back? In Luke 6, this is a parallel passage to the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus says, if you lend to those from whom you expect to receive, what credit is that to you? But do what is good and lend, expecting nothing in return. Then your reward will be great, and you'll be sons of the Most High, because he is gracious. So instead of thinking about what if I don't get it back, just try to be gracious to them like God is gracious to them. And maybe a final question that we want to ask in these situations is why? Why should I give something to somebody else? I mean, couldn't they have worked for it? Can't they really find another way to get this thing that they need? Can they live without this? Do they really need what they're asking me for? Why should I do this? And there's an overarching principle that really, I think, clarifies giving in our lives and why God would ask us to give up these resources that we have for someone else. And it's tucked away in Deuteronomy chapter 15. This is what the law of Moses says there. It says, there will be no poor among you, however, because the Lord is certain to bless you in the land the Lord your God is giving you to possess as an inheritance. Now this, in contrast with what we know of all of human history, sounds like a strange statement. There won't be any poor people among you. Yeah, right. Have we ever known a time in history when there are no poor people? Not at all. And what's interesting is at the end of this same passage, God says there will never cease to be poor people in your land. So he starts it out by saying there won't be any poor people in Israel. And he closes it by saying there's always going to be poor people in Israel. So what does he mean? Why is he saying that? He's saying there won't be any poor people in Israel if you do this. This is what he says a couple of verses later in Deuteronomy 15:5. He says, if. So there won't be any poor people in the land if only you obey the Lord your God, you're careful to follow every one of these commands I'm giving you today. And here's what God said after that. If there is a poor person among you, one of your brothers within any of your gates in the land the Lord your God is giving you, you must not be hard-hearted or tight-fisted toward your poor brother. So easy to be tight-fisted, isn't it? Especially in our culture where you got to hang on to your stuff, you got to grow your stuff and grow your portfolio and get more and more and more so that you can take it easy in life. But he says, don't be hard-hearted, don't be tight-fisted toward your poor brother or sister. Instead, you're to open your hand to him or her and freely loan him enough for whatever need he has. You've got the resources, don't be tight-fisted. Be careful that there isn't this wicked thought in your heart. The 7th year, the year of canceling debts, is near, and you get stingy toward your poor brother or sister. Because in Israel, they had a rule that we don't. Every 7 years, everybody's debts were supposed to be canceled. Can you imagine that rule in our country today? Every 7 years, your credit card balance goes to zero. Every 7 years, your college debt goes away. Every 7 years, your car payment's gone. Every 7 years, your house, you owe nothing on that. That was Israel at this point in time. And again, it was aimed at taking care of the needs of poor people and preventing all this debt. But somebody who was asked to loan something, like it's getting close to the 7th year and there's a knock at your door, hey, can I borrow $1,000? But the 7th year, it starts in a few days. What if you can't pay me back by then? And what if you never pay me back because you don't have to in a few days? I'm not going to give it to you. And God was saying, don't think like that. Open up your hand. Don't be tight-fisted. Meet this poor person's need that they revealed to you. So don't think like that. It says, give to him and don't have a stingy heart when you give. And because of this, the Lord your God will bless you in all your work and everything you do. So God knows he'll take care of you. For there will never cease to be poor people in the land. That's why I'm commanding you. You must willingly open your hand to your afflicted and your poor brother in the land. And so God's saying there's always going to be people with needs all around you. Your neighbors, your friends, your family members. People will always approach you with needs. But the way to prevent poverty and people in need is by us actually opening our hands and giving of what we have and doing something about that poverty and that affliction. So the key to preventing poverty is by using our generosity and the things that we have to prevent it, because there's always going to be people with needs, but we can eliminate it if we all respond to it, at least to a significant event or significant degree. And so that's what Jesus is saying. Be willing even to let go of resources, not just your rights, but your resources, because part of righteousness is letting go. It's a huge part of it. It's not about keeping all these rules, It's about letting go. Don't retaliate. Let go of your rights, because sometimes that accomplishes forward progress for God's kingdom. Let go of your resources. It's okay. God knows. It's part of his system to help people. And then finally, the fourth thing that we'll look at about righteousness, it's revaluation. Revaluation. So changing somebody's value from what people say it should be to what God says it actually is. Verse 43, Jesus says, you've heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. I want to pause really quickly here. Do you know where God said that? Love your neighbor and hate your enemy. Anybody really good with your Old Testament and you can pull out a reference? You have to be very good because it's nowhere to be found in Scripture. So hate your enemy is not in the Bible, period. But these Jews had heard it said. Where do you think they heard it said? Who was teaching them? The Pharisees and the religious leaders and the priests and the scribes and things like that. So you come to synagogue in that day and age, or we'll just take it into our world. You come to church and I tell you, hate your enemies. And you think that's what I should do because the religious leader told me, hate your enemies. And so surely that's what God says. And they probably could pull out some examples from the Old Testament of these battles or these strict consequences and say, God says, hate your enemies. Here's an example. The only problem was God never said that. And so Jesus is correcting a misunderstanding in this case, because religious leaders, they were teaching something that God never did. God actually said quite the contrary in the Old Testament. Exodus 23, 4 and 5, he said, if you come across your enemy's stray ox or donkey, there's their ox. I'm just going to take that, right? I hate that person. They'll never know. I'm going to hurt their donkey or take it. God says you must return it. You find this donkey that's stray, it belongs to your neighbor who's like just hurting you at every opportunity. Take it back to him. He says if you see the donkey of somebody who hates you lying helpless under its load, so they've overloaded it, they don't just mistreat you, they mistreat their animals, and this donkey is just, under hundreds of pounds of weight of being overloaded, just flat on the ground, it's helpless. And your first thought is just going to leave that there. It's their fault anyway. They mistreat me all the time. Why should I help that animal? God says, don't do that. He says, you must help with it. So you can't mistreat your enemy. In Leviticus 19, he says, don't take revenge or bear a grudge against a member of your community, whether they're a kind member of your community or whether they're a hateful member of your community. Don't bear a grudge. Finally, Proverbs 25, 21, God says, if your enemy is hungry, give him food to eat. If he's thirsty, give him water to drink. So don't mistreat your enemy. Love your enemy, which is what Jesus is getting to and what the Old Testament supports all along. But again, people had the wrong idea, and their leaders were teaching them the wrong thing about how to respond. Their leaders were really teaching them, your enemy is less valuable than you are, or less valuable certainly than your friends are. The people who treat you right, treat them right. They're of higher value. The people who are your enemies, who hurt you and mistreat you, they're not worth as much. So it's okay to mistreat those people. And Jesus is reminding them that hatred should never be fought with hate, which is a great principle. There have been people like Martin Luther King Jr. in our history of our country who have echoed that same kind of sentiment, same kinds of lines. You can't fight hate with hate. It never accomplishes anything, and especially not in God's kingdom. So in God's kingdom, Jesus is going to tell us how we react to hatred. He says, I tell you, so these people say, hate your enemy, but I tell you, love your enemies and pray for the people who persecute you so that you may be sons of your Father in heaven. Jesus is saying, you want to be like God, love your enemies. That's what he said all along in the Old Testament as well. And then pray for people who persecute you, who want to harm you. And so we react to hatred with love and prayer. We revalue people. We don't see our enemies as worth less. We see them as worth the same, and we put them, equal or above ourselves, and so we love them. We pray for them. We give them a drink when they need water. We give them food when they need food. It says here, for God causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and he sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. And this is Jesus still speaking in Matthew 5. So God sends rain on everyone, right? And rain, for us in southern Utah, rain's kind of a downer, right? You expect sunshine, or you come here on your vacations and you want a nice day to visit the parks, and then it starts raining. You think, oh, why did we get cursed with rain today? Maybe not right now because we need water desperately. And that was more of the view in Israel. Rain is a blessing. Rain means we have crops and food and adequate water to drink and all these things that we need. We have life because we have water and we have rain. God gives that blessing to everybody. God makes the sun come up on everybody, no matter how they treat him. And so we need to operate the same way. We need to bless everyone, regardless of how they treat us, just as God does. Verse 46, Jesus goes on to say, if you love those who love you, what reward will you have? Don't even tax collectors do the same? And again, tax collectors at this time had a really bad reputation for being very dishonest. And so don't even the people who are dishonest, they love the people who love them. What accomplishment is that? What does that show people about Christ when you just love the people that love you? He says, what reward do you have? And the implication is that if you love people who don't love you, God's going to be the one who gives the reward. God's going to reciprocate. So whenever you do something kind for somebody and they just act like it didn't even exist, God's going to reciprocate. In some way, he'll repay you. He'll reward you in his own time, in his own way, maybe in eternity. He'll take care of it. So don't worry about that. And finally, he says, if you greet only your brothers, what are you doing out of the ordinary? Don't even the Gentiles, the non-Jews, do the same? It's all about showing kindness, not just to people who are like us or people who agree with us or people who treat us well, but to everybody. Jesus is saying everyone deserves our kindness. And I think the reason is because everybody ultimately reflects God's image. The very beginning of the Bible in Genesis, God created man and woman in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. People who are enemies, people who are friends, people who love God, people who hate God, people who don't think God even exists. They're all created in God's image. So we need to revalue them as people who are created in God's image, regardless of how they treat us, and to treat them with that same kindness that anyone made in the image of God deserves, because they reflect his image. They reflect his image. Jesus closes by saying, be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect. And so he's saying the goal is to be complete or perfect like God is. Our goal is to resemble God. We're never going to reach that, but it's to resemble God a little bit more. And so how can I be a little bit more like God? And that's really what righteousness is in the first place, right? It's not following a list of rules. It's right relationships, fostering a right relationship with God, with people, and imitating God in those relationships. I think that's probably a better definition of righteousness than the rules mentality that we tend to have. So as we close, I just want to throw a few questions out for you to consider this morning. Think about assessments or actions. First of all, this is kind of considering last week and this week. How do I define righteousness? How do I define pleasing God? Is it following the right rules? If I do A, B, C, D, and E perfectly, if I keep all these commands on a list, that's pleasing God? Or is it really fostering right relationships with God and with the way I treat people? Is that closer to what righteousness really is in God's eyes? Secondly, righteousness is pursuing reconciliation and reliability with God and people. It also involves relinquishing our rights and our resources for the benefit of other people. And that's the key, for the benefit of people. And also revaluing people with the worth God has given them instead of the worth we think they deserve based on how they treat us. So that's everything in a nutshell from the last 2 weeks. Thirdly, is there a right that I need to give up for the sake of God's kingdom? Yeah, sure, I have the right, but if I give it up, would it really be better for somebody else and the way that they see God through me? 4, is there a resource I need to give or loan to a neighbor to promote equality and dignity? There's something that I need to let go of and release that God's given me really to bless somebody else or to bring up them to a place of a little bit more equality or dignity. And then lastly, is there an opportunity to respond to someone's hatred with love and prayer? A lot of us, we look back on our lives, and maybe right now we have a very short list of people that we feel like hate us, Most of the time, hopefully that's the case. Don't have a long list of haters. But maybe there's a few of you who, there are some people, and they're just poking and prodding with every opportunity they get. Maybe it's people in your family or friends or former friends, but somebody that you just can't avoid, and they take every every chance they have to try to hurt you in some way. And you just want to hurt them back. You just want to hate them back. But trying to actually do loving things and acts of kindness to them is a stretch. And taking time to pray for them, that's a hard switch mentally. But that's more righteous. And that's more in line with what God's kingdom has in store than the way that we're tempted to respond in and of ourselves. So let's go ahead and close and wrap up this morning. God, I just want to say thank you again without, again, summarizing all of this information. I thank you that you've given us each other for support in all of these endeavors. I thank you that you've given your Holy Spirit to us to empower us in these relationships. And I thank you that you've given us more than just a set of rules, because those are insufficient anyway to accomplish a change in our life and to really make all the changes that we could imagine, because we could never come up with enough rules. But having this relational approach is very different, and the motive is very different. And I think the hope is a lot more encouraging. So please help us to view righteousness and what that is more in light of relationships than just a list to follow. In Christ's name, amen.